A quick note on geopolitical history. In September 27, 1938, FDR wrote to Adolf Hitler appealing for peace. The war hadn't yet started, but the signs were very present. Hitler felt that, after the First World War, 20 years prior, Germany was treated unfairly. Parts of the newly formed Czechoslovakia was carved from Germany. Hitler called it the Sudetenlands. In his response back to FDR, on the same day, Hitler made this grievance very clear. Nearly 1 year later, Germany had annexed 2 countries before invading Poland. The meetings with Putin before his invasion of Ukraine were eerily reminiscent of the meeting with Hitler on the eve of the Second World War. The leaders of France, Germany, and the US met Putin in person. Biden met Putin twice. One of the grievances that Putin brought up and continues to maintain is that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a geopolitical catastrophe. Words are words, sometimes they're just bluster. However, when actions are taken, those words must suggest real intent. Look on a map at where the borders of the Soviet Union were laid. Then shit your pants. I know, it's mentioned on a daily basis on news channels that Putin isn't doing too well in the war, which has merit. However, leaders of military intelligence, particularly Ben Wallace, the Secretary of State of Defense in the UK, and Admiral John Kirby of the National Security Council in the US, have been saying since the beginning of the war that Russia has not been using their full strength. They have a lot more capability at their disposal. What I find equally astounding and utterly terrifying is the gap in the forces used during the annexation of Poland in WW2, which took 1 month, versus the forces used so far in the special military operation that started more than a year ago. It took 2 million soldiers to annex a country, 1/3 of the size of Ukraine, in 1 month. At first glance it seems Putin was attempting to take all of Ukraine with just shy of 200,000 soldiers. Bizarre to say the least. 500 years of coalition wars in Europe. In 1688, the French monarch, Louis XIV, who may or may not be related to any of the other Louis that came before or after, was on an empire high. After a series of annexations and wars, France was left the most powerful kingdom in Europe, you might even say the Western Hemisphere. However, over the Rhine River was a bridge too far. The Holy Roman Empire wouldn't have it. Neither would the rest of Europe. A coalition named the Grande Alliance was formed. It was predominantly made up of the Holy Roman Empire and only 3 countries we would recognize today: England, Scotland, and Spain. The conflict was dubbed the 9 Years' War. Death count, 680,000. In 1700, the Great Northern War started. The Tsardom of Russia wanted to take advantage of a weakened Sweden. 2 moderately messy coalitions were formed to defend Sweden. Although Russia was the leader of the coalition against Sweden, it seems Great Britain changed sides twice. First for Sweden, then against Sweden, then again for Sweden. Again, a whole bunch of countries that aren't on the map today fought this one. The only 3 nations easily discernible today are Sweden, Great Britain, and the Tsardom of Russia. But in name only. All 3 countries' borders were drastically different. Russia hadn't yet conquered any of Eurasia, Britain only had slivers of North and South America, and Sweden's empire overlapped to where Finland lays today. Over 20 years, 500,000 people were killed by famine and fighting. In 1799, France became a military dictatorship, whose leader was Napoleon I. France was again the largest power in Europe. Napoleon sought to expand France's borders. Around the year 1803, France began its conquest. This again led to the creation of a number of coalitions just to destroy France. During the course of this fragmented war, France took Spain and Austria, while causing the collapse and dismantling of the Holy Roman Empire. Swaths of the Holy Roman Empire were cut away to make what was then called Prussia. France also cut its way into Russia. A rule of thumb was pointed out, in analysis of this, and other conflicts with an aggressor pushing east into Russia. The rule is don't. At the end of the Napoleonic Wars, 6 million people were killed or missing. In 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, with the help of Soviet Russia. In 1 year, the Germans swept west across Europe, cutting France in half. They pressed north into Scandinavia, but left Finland for the Soviets. The Germans took the Baltics and the Balkans. However, then Germany decided for some reason to go for Moscow. This led to Germany's defeat because they couldn't fight the Allies and the Soviets at the same time. Once Germany was crushed, Russia kept what it conquered. This left Europe quite literally divided in two, from 1945 until 1991. Over the course of the war, in Asia, Africa, and Europe, roughly 80 million people died. In these examples of major conflict over the centuries, it shows over time alliances change. Sometimes they change during a war, sometimes they change between wars. Once arch enemies, become unrivaled friends. As well, the leaders of the aggressive states become less hated as time passes. Surely, Napoleon was an orc ruler of Mordor. However, he's just a character in a book now. A reference used to describe someone's physical stature. He's a painting. The man and his intentions are hardly ever mentioned or commented on, for being good or bad. Things just happened. If you remember them, you get a good mark on the pop quiz. It must be due to time, or another overshadowing event that may just be more recent in memory. Hitler is still seen as the root of all evil. He's still a boogeyman to reference when expressing insult to someone, or used to describe someone's malevolence. However, Germany is a friend. A friendly nation, filled with beautiful and techno-savvy individuals. As well with France. It is far removed from its Napoleonic history. We nor hold Napoleon as a boogeyman, nor do we hold contempt for the nation he presided over. How long do you suppose will it take for the idea of Putin and Russia as an evil place to fade from our minds? To be honest, the war is either in very early days, or Putin will die and fade before it's over. As well, Putin may be overshadowed entirely by Xi Jinping. It's very likely that the Pacific War will be much more ferocious and consequential. Anyways, the reason for this segment is to bring up an idea and perhaps expand on it. In North America, the indigenous populations, for the most part, were wiped out. It's a tragedy, of course, but to think of the indigenous as weak and sad victims is probably to belittle them. Their heritage is rich and diverse, just like their history. Before European settlers landed on North American shores, the tribes of old fought between themselves, for the same reasons the Europeans fought. Just because they lost, doesn't mean they're hopeless. They fought valiantly to defend their land and way of life, but they lost. In the 17th century, wars weren't an event or conflict between good and evil. They were sort of a state of being. Or a location. Or an occupation. Powers of the globe were at war with someone constantly. The ideas of state borders were a concept not even clearly defined until the 20th century. There were no countries. There were empires and kingdoms. One's borders weren't the divide between you and your peaceful and friendly nation neighbor. They were the front lines. Borders were ebbing and flowing constantly. What propelled borders one way or another was the power behind them. To cast a 21st century eye on a 17th century event in conflict is to be confused. The European settlers, of course, knew there were aboriginals to fight off, but the world was for the taking. If you fought off any contender for land you wanted, you owned it. Now, I'm not saying the indigenous had it coming, and they deserved what happened to them. They had no chance, because they had no idea the sort of power the Europeans could yield, and the diseases they carried. What I'm saying is, they fought valiantly and should be honored. However, if a country knows of the capabilities of the powers around them, and still does nothing to improve their odds in battle, it could be said, they deserve their plight. However, it doesn't mean their efforts should not be honored, after some time. A lot of time, long time after the horrors of war are forgotten. Anyhow, what I'm trying to explain is, that at a state level, nation to nation, empire to empire, there is no one police. The ebb and flow of borders in times past is the status quo. The idea that countries' borders remain in their shape and are frozen was created June 26, 1945, when the United Nations was established. If trouble is started, it's for the UN to be the police officer. It's been working for the most part. However, if there's a malevolent power that can take on and win against a coalition formed using the United Nations, that power is the law until it's defeated. Right now, with the war in Ukraine, I believe Putin is attempting to hark back to a time where nations competed with knives and fists constantly. I think he's okay with the war going on for decades. Russia today wasn't carved out in a 4-year incursion. It took hundreds of years. The Soviet land grab of the Second World War could have been the fastest expansion of borders in history. I'm not sure Putin is expecting an outcome like that. I'm not sure he expects to live out the full expansion. Xi, on the other hand, seems a bit more capable. According to ministers in Taiwan, with statements suggested to be credible by the United States State Department, Xi's China intends to take the islands from Japan to Indonesia. The excessive manpower at the PLA's disposal is alarming. However, this alarming information is attempting to be addressed. If the West loses that war, it'll be with honor. Of course, there are things that are being left idle and manipulated, specifically in North America, that if are left unchecked, could be reason to say the West deserved to lose their next major fight. Next time I'll dive into immigration, economy and politics of North America.